Welcome back to the show. Joining me this week is author Matt Lysiak, who recently put out the book Fiat Food, How Inflation Has Destroyed Our Health and How Bitcoin Fixes This. There are some chapters in here by Saifedean. So Matt, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to talk about this book with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Thanks, Natalie.
Well, first, let's talk a little bit about your background and how you even came to write this, because we have sort of similar backgrounds. You've been doing investigative journalism for a long time. Specifically, you used to do crime reporting. So how did you want to look into essentially the crimes that are happening with big food?
For nearly 20 years, I was an investigative crime reporter for the New York Daily News, which when I was there was the fifth biggest paper in the country. Specifically, my job was national. So anytime a major breaking news story hit around the country, I would have a backpack in my car, hit the next flight, parachute in. How I became turned on to Fiat Food and this concept, it brings me back to COVID. During COVID, a lot of the accepted norms that I had just inherently believed, even though I was skeptical and have been dealing with government corruption most of my life as a journalist, it really jumped the shark to the extent that it led me down to this rabbit hole of economics, and I began reading the work of Saifedean. I think your audience is probably familiar with Saif. He wrote a book called The Bitcoin Standard, which I enjoyed, but it was a book called The Fiat Standard, which really turned my attention to this subject, because in it there's this very brief 8-page chapter 8, where he talks about what struck me at the time as a very bizarre conspiracy intertwining food and economics. And I have so much respect for Saif's work as an economist. I was completely confused by this chapter. Now, Saif is neither a nutritionist or an investigative reporter. So I was like, what is this nonsense? And I began fact-checking the chapter, and what became apparent very quickly was not only had Saif hit this correct right on the mark, but he was understating what I would say, and not to be hyperbolic, but to me struck me as the most compelling conspiracy in terms of health consequences on the American people of the past century.
Coin Stories is proudly brought to you by Bitdeer, a global leader in disruptive technology for Bitcoin mining and AI. As a publicly traded leader, Bitdeer boasts a massive 2.5 gigawatts of electrical capacity and infrastructure under development across 3 continents, positioning Bitdeer as one of the most diversified and power-dense computing companies in the world. Bitdeer's leadership pioneered the original advancements in Bitcoin mining ASICs and is now poised to disrupt the market again with groundbreaking new designs for the next generation of mining ASICs that are targeted to reach efficiencies of as low as 5 joules per terahash by late next year. Now they're leveraging years of expertise in data center and cloud management into high-performance computing through a partnership with NVIDIA. Join Bitdeer in reshaping the world of Bitcoin mining. Learn more at bitdeer.com and explore how they are pioneering the future today. Yeah, I mean, digging into this, it really it makes you feel not just disappointed, but also a little scared about where the future is going if we stay on this same path, because people are getting unhealthier every single year. And yet our GDP sort of relies on us being sick. The sicker that we are and the more that we spend on healthcare, that boosts our GDP, which is so backwards, right? I mean, shouldn't it be great if all of us are actually healthy? And in the same way that I think that people all recognize that there's some problem with our financial system, that it's not as accessible to the average person for opportunity, that the average worker is feeling left behind, and it's harder to just make a living. But also I think people recognize that there's something broken with our food and our health system, because look at beaches, right? A couple decades ago, everyone's skinny and they were eating meat and going to McDonald's, but things were prepared differently. Ingredients were different. And so I want to dig into a lot of what your book discusses, because it seems like we have this, the term you use is agro-industrial complex, right? I mean, it starts with how our food is actually produced. So what do you want people to know about what's really changed in the last 50 or so years about the quality of what we're actually putting in our mouths and also what the powers that be are telling us is healthy.
You go back to 1970, and the American public, on average, ate 155 pounds of red meat a year. You fast forward till now, and we're less than half that amount. Now, what has happened? Well, it's a very pre 1970. You had a country where there were all these actors at play trying to change our food supply for their own profit. In particular, corporate interests who would fund nutrition research and would control a lot of the nutrition science that came out, and it was always trying to sway the American public from red meat to more profitable foods. Like I would point to Procter and Gamble's Crisco, which, when introduced, the American public, like margarine, did not identify cottonseed as a part of the food system. It wasn't. And a huge marketing campaign slowly over time changed that and made it acceptable. And it replaced a lot of the natural fats that humans have been eating for thousands of years, of lard and suet. But 1971 came, in particular August 15th. And when Richard Nixon delivered a speech called the Nixon Shock, where he officially decoupled from gold, you see everything change. Now, pre-1971, before this speech, we were on a partial gold standard, where the American public was not allowed to redeem their promissory notes for gold, but foreign countries could. And this put a powerful restraint on spending. And what you find when you look back on history is that governments can survive corruption. We'll keep voting these people in. Governments can be at constant war, and we still support them. But when food prices go too high, that is always followed by government instability. And I'll point to a study from, it's called the American University out of Washington, D.C., where they found in 2022, 12,500 food and energy related riots in Europe alone. And you could go to Sri Lanka and think back and remember what your audience probably remembers what happened in 2022 when the price of food skyrocketed. They stormed the capital and the leaders had to flee. So what you had in 1971 was Nixon's decoupling meant that we were going to flood the economy with more dollars that were untethered, unrestrained to any gold. And when I was doing my research, I came across many documents where administration officials were very concerned about the rising cost of food. And what they decided to do at that moment was to alter the food supply, because the goal wasn't to make us less healthy. The goal was to keep food prices low to maintain a hold of political power. And they were very, very sensitive to this issue. And you have the Secretary of Agriculture, a man named Earl Butz, being now given $1 gazillion in subsidies that he would dispense to farms towards corn, soy, wheat, towards the consolidation of the American food system to make sure food would stay cheap. Because in reality, even today, if I'm just going to I have 4 daughters, Natalie, if I'm going to feed my kids, I can feed them relatively cheaply with 4 boxes of cereal today. It gets pretty cheap. But if I want to feed them the nutrients that humans need to thrive, red meat, eggs, it's cost prohibitive. Essentially, if you're eating nothing but Doritos and cereal, you don't notice monetary inflation and you feel like your leaders are doing a pretty good job on that end. But if you're looking to have the foods that humans need, you're going to become very dissatisfied. And this went in conjunction with what I would call a 60-year psyop to convince us that the food that our ancestors have eaten for thousands of years was actually unhealthy. That was wrong. That was a crazy fad. These new processed plant foods, which they can make almost like fiat dollars. They can just print them out at scale. That's what we need to eat. And you see through the government apparatus created by fiat, all these dollars flowing to, for instance, Loma University in California, which is run by the Seventh Day Adventist Church, which is a religious group which advocates vegetarianism, pushing these phony studies that constantly tell us that meat is bad, that grains are good. And if you want to see the consequences, go to Walmart in any part of America right now and just look in line, and you'll see that people are sick, very, very sick.
Okay, so in 1971, we went off the gold standard. That was the last period of severe CPI inflation that I think people watching this might remember prior to the pandemic inflation increase. And one thing that you had in your book that was really interesting was how they manipulated the CPI. They took out the things that people were eating and replaced them with essentially cheaper, less healthy things so that it didn't look like CPI had increased that much. So although I personally think it's a little bit intuitive, can you kind of crystallize and clarify why is this plant-based industrial food so much cheaper than, say, a healthy meal that has red meat or tallow or uses like real animal products and fats?
Real animal product. You're completely right about CPI, and I almost feel embarrassed about how much time I spend. I'm not at heart an economics guy. How much time I spent dedicated trying to understand CPI, only to realize it's just a complete statistical tautology. It's like a marketing campaign. And when it came out in World War I, it was actually a decent, reliable barometer. They'd have like beef one year, and then you can measure it against beef another year, and you could see the rise or the same. But what happens in 1971, Arthur Burns, what he didn't even hide it. He was just like, this is showing this is not good. We need to just basically take anything out that reflected poorly on the current administration. So you have this ridiculous campaign where CPI's act. I find it hilarious. I know you appear in a lot of these business shows, and how serious these very clear-minded economists take the CPI when it comes out, and it's almost laughable. It's like, all right, it's because it's ridiculous. I mean, it's not a clear barometer. But to get back to what you were saying, cows, chickens, you can't print them like you can print a Dorito. So you can make these mass foods at scale. And also, the political climate in 1970 is hard for people today to understand what that was like. But at the time, a book called The Population Bomb was released. And it was written by one of history's most glorious morons who like had this central thesis, and he posited that we shouldn't be eating meat because it was too resource intensive, and we're essentially going to end up eating ourselves into starvation. And his name was Paul Ehrlich. He made a series of predictions, like in 1986, everybody's going to starve to death. But he keeps staying relevant, and it's because he's sort of a tool of the propaganda machine that's been created to make meat seem bad. But it was this sort of hysteria back in the 70s that corresponded and then became weaponized by the federal government. I grew up in the 90s where the population bomb was still being taught in school. Like, we were going to run out of people. I mean, the reality is a little bit different. We're actually running out of people. And you could attribute that, at least in part, to lower fertility rates brought on by a lot of these plant-based diets.
Yeah, it's really crazy when you look at the consequences of manipulating what nutrients are going into our bodies. I think one of the things that is most difficult to wrap your head around is that idea of a conspiracy. I think for a lot of people, it's like we want to believe that the average person is good, has great intentions, especially if they're in a role of leadership or they're in a role to help make America healthy. Can you touch on that a little bit for those that watch things like this, or maybe they've been hearing things in the news lately about some of these corrupt relationships between big food, big pharma, our government leaders, and they go, that just can't be true. Why would they put out studies that are making people sicker? And if they were, people would find out, there would be investigative journalists that would shed light on it, and we would go down a better path. What's actually happening?
It's a great point. I know this concept of what I'm explaining is really difficult to grasp for a lot of people because I mean I grew up, Natalie, believing in a lot of our institutions in America, and even as a reporter I thought, well, I found out, I mean, I've interviewed former presidents and senators and governors, and what you kind of discover is that most of these people, they're not horrible people, but they're not looking out for the American public. They're not trying to hurt the American public. They're trying to maintain power. And in Fiat Food, I outline this incentive process that was created. And it's not people sitting, I could not find, there's no smoky room. There's no part of my book where I'm like, aha, look, all these people have gathered here and they've decided they're going to hurt the people. No, because the incentive structure was set up in such a way, what you have is everything else falls in line. And I would argue that there's never in history been a more powerful weapon than the fiat money printer, because what that does is it weaponizes the entire productive labor of not just the American public, but since Bretton Woods, almost the entire world. You can take their labor, because under fiat, you don't really own your dollar. It's a slogan. I mean, if somebody else can print an unlimited amount of what they're claiming is your money, that's not your money. So when that fiat money printer was pointed in the direction of trying to change the food supply to make Americans and to hide the consequences of monetary inflation, when that happened, it was monumental, because all these other, and I think about this a lot recently because there's a lot of, this has become a hot subject, right? Like, why is our food supply altered? And one of the things that kind of drives me crazy, and these people are doing great work, so let there be no misunderstanding, but it's kind of like they're still arguing about the symptoms, and they're not treating the core of the disease. The core of the disease is the degradation of our money. Without that, there is no influence campaign that needs to hide inflation, because it doesn't exist. Instead, we're all arguing around the edges. And as evidence, I would say, trust me, before 1970, there was heavy corporate influence in nutrition, yet still we are eating meat. We're eating tons of meat. We're eating meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and we're far healthier. The shift that happened is fiat. And people's eyes glaze over sometimes when you talk about it, when we talk about economics. But if you really want to get to the core of this problem, if you really want to get to the source of why America is sick, you have to go back to the core root of these incentives. And it starts with our money supply.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. You have to go to the real source of the problem, which is our broken financial system. It's crazy how many examples you had in this book of literally fraud. I mean, people who were paid to say that the science was one thing versus what the truth was, and to hide the true studies, the results of studies that would have countered the mainstream narrative. That's really hard, I think, for some people to, again, just wrap their head around, to believe that that wouldn't be exposed somehow. But when you layer on these incentives, and when it gets so widespread, and you have it in these very powerful institutions, including the big universities like the Harvards, right? And the New York Times reporting on this and reinforcing it to the public, all of a sudden it becomes kind of core. And you touched on something, and that this movement's kind of gaining steam. I think a lot of people are paying attention right now. I credit some of that to RFK Jr., who has now his new slogan, "Make America Healthy Again." There was that viral interview with Casey Means, who talked about all the problems in our healthcare system, as well as with our food, and why everyone's becoming sick. And so I think perfect timing for your book. Do you think, though, that it's going to be really challenging to go up against these companies? Because although I want to have hope that we can turn this around if the masses, so to speak, want something better, I just think that these corporations are so powerful, and their lobbying arms in Washington, D.C. have such deep pockets that it's a really difficult thing to fix.
Yeah, and I want this to be part of the podcast where I give everybody this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I don't have that. But what I can say is that when, and in this period right now, as long as there's this trend of podcasts like yours and the decentralized system of news, as long as, 20, 30 years ago, it was like three networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and this kind of message would never have been able to get out. My book wouldn't have been able to find a publisher. But because news has become decentralized through the internet, as long as internet stays free, what will happen, I believe, is that people like Casey Means, who's done great work, and her brother, and yourself, Sean Baker, Saifedean and Moose, these decentralized platforms of information, we can get the message out. And what I want to tell people is they don't need to buy my book. You don't need to study nutrition. Just eat what your great-great-grandmother ate. Try it for 30 days. And don't listen to your doctor, who's probably overweight and wheezing when he's trying to speak to you. See how your body feels. It's unbelievable. I cannot explain the life hack. I am about 95% carnivore. I'm still drinking coffee to my, I can't go without it yet. But the effects on my life have been monumental. I mean, it's
Cheers to that.
Cheers to that, right? So I would encourage your audience to just give it a try.
I have some questions about the carnivore diet, but before we get into that, I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the specific things that you discuss with regards to how basically our leaders are recommending things like Cocoa Puffs and Reese's peanut butter cups and these crazy, just common sense tells you that these things are unhealthy, yet they're listed on actual dietary guidelines as healthier than things like eggs or red meat. Can you talk specifically to that?
Your audience is going to think I'm insane. What I'm about to tell you is completely true. Yes, like in January of 2023, I think about this a lot because there's these people whose whole life has been dedicated to understanding nutrition. Like this is their job. This is what they wake up and do. And the Tuft Food Compass, which is considered in America the leading nutritional guideline, in 2023 released their health barometer, which stipulated that Fruit Loops are healthier than red meat. Chocolate flavored soy milk is healthier than whole milk. On and on. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that in that same month, January of 2023, 60 Minutes had a news show hosted by renowned journalist Leslie Stahl with a doctor in a pristine white coat called Dr. Fatima Stanford, who informed us that obesity was no longer a lifestyle choice, that cutting-edge science has shown her that it's actually a, quote, brain disease. Later that month, so that show, that 60-minute show, I should mention, was sponsored by Ozempic. That was their main advertiser. She was a paid consultant for Ozempic. There was one other expert on that show who was also a paid consultant from Ozempic. There was no pushback. Later that month, so this comes out the same month the Food Pyramid came out. And then later that month, the American Pediatric Association, for the very first time, changed their standards to say that children as young as 12 should be prescribed these weight loss drugs. Now, I'm pretty harsh on Dr. Fatima Stanford because I think there's few things that you could do that are more damaging to a human than to tell them they're not responsible for one of the most fundamental aspects of human existence, our own health. So that's what she's doing. She's undermining our own independence. So we need to bow down to the white coats who have lied to us for years as we've gotten sicker and sicker. So I have no evidence that there was a smoky room where 60 Minutes met with Dr. Fatima Stanford, met with Big Food, met with Ozempic, met with the American Pediatric Association. But this all happened within the span of 6 weeks. So you'd have to be a little naive to think that it was completely disconnected. It was all by coincidence. I don't know. So it's very, very troubling, the amount of propaganda that is being pushed out. And it's also, historically, it's switched. So you go back to the 40s, and it was don't eat red meat because red meat's really healthy and we need to save it for the troops at war. And then it was don't eat red meat in the 70s because it was too resource intensive and we're running out of food and everybody's going to starve. And then today it's you have Mayor Eric Adams in New York City saying that the kids in public schools are not going to be able to eat red meat on Mondays and Wednesdays to change the thermostat of the earth.
Right.
So it shifts and it switches, but the message always stays the same, and that is to eat like peasants from the 1400s and to not eat the food that our ancestors have eaten for thousands of years from which we've evolved.
And these guidelines don't really apply to the elites. They're eating as much meat probably as they want. One thing that you talked about in the book that you were alluding to with your response just there is how we've removed accountability from and consequences really from our choices. It's not our fault. It's somehow just we can't control it. We have no control over some of these decisions, which I think is really sad. And the other thing that is really scary is how young it starts with children, like you're saying. I mean, they're kind of programming you at a young age to not just believe in the science, but also, I mean, the marketing of, I remember when I was young, the cereal, it looks the best when you're walking through a supermarket. You see all these fun characters. And I remember in 1996, that gymnastics Olympic team was so popular, and it was all the Wheaties boxes with the inspiring gymnasts, and all the unhealthy food is really like marketed towards you. And what I didn't know is that brands like Coca-Cola have actual contracts with high schools and schools. So they're pumping this unhealthy stuff to you at a young age, which is then pretty addictive, and you're a customer for life.
Yeah, it's absolutely appalling. I grew up in the 90s, and I grew up under the 1992 food pyramid, which many of your audience may
Yeah.
remember. And it asked us to eat between 8 to 11 servings of grains a day. And at the very top of the pyramid was meat. You're supposed to have very few amounts of that. So I grew up in a public school system. It became against the law to serve whole milk. And so they're serving low fat milk, which tasted horrible. So they began infusing it with strawberry and chocolate sugar flavoring.
Mm-hmm.
And they replaced the lard that used to fry our chicken nuggets with these seed oil science atrocities. And the cheese became some kind of gooey, low fat mess. By the time the average kid came out of high school, they're already metabolically compromised.
Yeah.
And I sometimes think one of the victims of this whole system that we've created, which is to the benefit of corporations, the capture's been unreal, has been, it's like you think of Henry T. Ford and you go back to read about the Wright brothers and how the consensus was that humans would never be able to fly, but they were brave and they took these steps and these challenges a lot of people took, and these young entrepreneurs. What you look at, would Henry Ford have invented the Model T on a diet of Fruit Loops? You look at the fat, flabby bodies coming out of schools, and it's not the kids' faults. They're listening to the science. They're actually conforming to what the government's telling them to eat. And as a result, they've become a lifelong customer of first industrialized food and then the medical industrial complex, which comes in at the tail end to recover
Yeah.
whatever's left of their shortened lives.
It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners who make this podcast possible. First up, Casa. It is so easy to set up your Bitcoin 3-key self-custody with Casa that I can show you pretty much the whole process in just 30 seconds. You're watching it right now. I recently switched to Casa for multi-sig collaborative custody and inheritance planning because of their enhanced non-KYC required privacy and the ease of this mobile app. Make sure to watch the tutorials and get your Casa plan for 10% off at casa.io/Natalie. Next up, Speed Lightning Wallet, one of the fastest growing Bitcoin wallets out there. Speed is a secure, low-cost way to send and receive Bitcoin and stablecoins instantly. The app is super simple to use and customers love it. Download Speed using the QR code on the screen or the link in my show notes. Use promo code CoinStories10 to get 5,000 free sats. And finally, are you ready to take control of your wealth? The Bitcoin way is here to empower you. Learn how to take full self-custody and eliminate all counterparty risk. Set up your node and become the master of your own transactions and enjoy true autonomy. And upgrade your cybersecurity and protect your online privacy like I did. The Bitcoin way specializes in personalized one-on-one training to help you become fully self-sovereign. Schedule a free consultation today. What you shared about 60 Minutes was hard for me to read because I grew up really idolizing that show. I thought that they were noble journalists. I loved Leslie Stahl. So when I see examples like you gave of that story and how compromised it really was, that shakes me to my core. And I'm going to share something personal. Some people that are listening or watching this might be familiar with this because I've sort of shared it before. But my family is first generation immigrants from Poland, and our diet in Poland was very, very different. And when I was young, I was getting bombarded with the exact messaging that you write about in Fiat Food, that this type of food is healthy. You should go low fat and you should eat all this processed stuff. And here's the food pyramid. And I would come home and I would share what I learned, right, at school and what my peers and my friends were eating to my mom. And my mom just immediately was so dismissive of everything that I shared with her, saying, no, margarine's not good. Low fat is not good. You have to eat fat. You have to eat butter. You have to eat meat. This is crazy. They're lying. And I'll be honest with you, when I was young, I thought my mom was crazy. I thought she's paranoid. She grew up in this weird place and she doesn't understand. I mean, this is America. This is what the doctors are telling us. This is what the news is telling us. That has to be right. And my mom's cuckoo over here. And now, thank goodness for her influence over my diet when I was young, because I did eat so differently from my friends. And I didn't have the type of weight troubles that some of my friends did, or just even the energy issues that maybe some of my friends dealt with at a young age, until I went to college. And then I was basically on my own for the very first time eating cafeteria food. And I not only gained a lot of weight my freshman year of college, but I felt terrible. And when I went to a nutritionist at the college that I attended, they prescribed me things like crackers and granola bars and all these things. And until I came home, and it was really funny, my mom literally had an intervention my first summer back from college. She put me on a diet, and it was not what most people would think. It was actually a lot of meat and fresh foods, and I was able to drop all the weight, thankfully. But I had that real experience. And so I think I was more skeptical than the average person. But I think that a lot of people reading this thought what I thought when I was younger, right? That like, there's no way that these people would allow us to be harmed. They're in positions of, they're doctors, or they're in the government. They have our best interest at heart. Do you want to share a reaction to
Dude,
that?
first of all, yeah, I'm Polish too. You're lucky. You should feel very fortunate to have a mother like that, because it's hard. I mean, I ate so much garbage, and I got cancer when I was 16. I was basically hospitalized for 2 years, and I remember the doctors. I remember
Oh
asking
my
the doctor
God.
in my hospital bed, why did I get cancer? And they're like, well, we don't know. I intuitively knew I was very overweight. I intuitively knew I was doing something wrong. But just to give your audience like a measure of what kind of the psyop and a little bit of evidence on it, they've all heard of Ansel Keys, famed nutritionist who
Mhm.
was the leading voice in nutrition for decades in America, and everything he said went. He was bribed by the sugar industry,
Yeah.
and then he had this theory that saturated fat found in red meat raised cholesterol, which caused heart issues. And it was only a hypothesis, and he pushed it. And a lot of scientists are like, you have no evidence. You're using these observational studies, which almost all nutritional studies that you read are observational studies, meaning they can't establish a
Yeah.
causal relationship, just association. So finally, in 1967, he was like, "Look, I'm gonna do a clinical gold standard study," and it was a really good study. He was able to control all of the food because it was conducted in nursing homes and mental institutions in Minnesota. Lasted 4 years, from 1967 to 1971. 1971 comes around, results don't come out. Nobody knows what happened to this study. Finally, decades later, I hate to give credit to the New York Times. I've worked for them for a period, and they're not the paper they used to be, but they did fantastic work. They uncovered one of the relatives of one of the scientists who worked on this study, and they went down and they found all of the research. And what the research revealed was that not only did it not back up Ansel Keys' heart health hypothesis, which is what everybody expected it to do, but it actually validated the exact opposite conclusion. So lower cholesterol was associated with higher health risks, while higher cholesterol was associated with better health outcomes. And
Mm.
Gary Taub's a great science researcher who found one of these people who were actually on a study and asked, why didn't you ever release this? Because since that time, our whole food system was based on this premise that red meat raised cholesterol. This was the only study that was actually a clinical study that totally invalidated it. And his response, the scientist's response, who worked on a study, was super telling. He said, there was nothing wrong with the study, but, quote, we were just so disappointed in the results. You got to understand that there's a whole institutional apparatus set up around the idea that saturated meat caused health issues and reputations, money. That could not be given up, and reputations. And then, in 1980, we had the first government intervention into food. Before then, the government had nothing to do with food. They weren't, like, lions aren't having to read books. They don't to know what to eat. Somehow we're all confused. And every iteration has always been more grains, less meat, which conforms to their hope that, we're all eating a bunch of grains, not because they want us sick, just so that they don't notice the consequences of monetary inflation created by fiat.
Can you speak to how addictive this type of food is? Because one thing that even I've experienced is when you try to go off of a diet that's heavy in highly processed foods or a lot of carbohydrates, it's hard. You feel hungry all the time. And I think that's why so many people end up yo-yo dieting and just having a really hard time because it that food, it's like you crave it.
Yeah, no, and I have so much compassion for people who are addicted to the standard American diet. There's very well-paid people in industry who are trying to make these foods addictive and succeeding.
Mhm.
I mean, I probably don't need to explain. I think everybody listening knows exactly what you're talking about. We've all experienced it. I'm I'm at so I go to a farmer's market to get my raw milk. It's like 20 minutes away from where I live in Arizona, and this is true. I feel kind of embarrassed saying this, but there's a donut place that's delicious, and it's right past it. I have to drive around it. Like, I won't even let myself drive by it because I'm still, even though I've been eating well for years, I still can't. I'm worried about my self control. It's heavily addicted. They did a study that found you take sugar, and up until 1850, it was not refined, so it was diluted and it had some fiber in it and some other things. But the same process that you make cocaine, where you get the very essence of the plant, is how you make refined sugar now. And it's remarkably addictive. And they found in a study that it was 9 times more addictive in rats than cocaine is. So I love these people who are like, everything in moderation. I mean, that's marketing. That's marketing. It's no, like, I can't do a moderate amount of cocaine, and I also can't do a moderate amount of sugar. I don't know that. I know there's those people who exist who could have one cookie. I'm just not one of them.
Well, you raise an interesting point, and this is where I have questions that sort of push back on some of what's in the book because again, I come from Europe. And when you look at the diets of many European countries, people eat a lot of carbs. They eat a lot of pasta and bread and a pastry in the morning, which arguably a lot of them have sugar in it. I grew up eating treats and sweets, but they were made with beet sugar. In fact, to this day, I still use beet sugar instead of cane sugar. In Italy, I mean, they have some of the longest lifespans in certain parts of the country, and they eat pasta all the time. I had the chance to live there for 2 years, and I loved the Italian diet. How are those folks healthy? Or even when you look at places in Asia, Japan, higher intakes of things like rice. Why are they so healthy? They're not carnivores.
It's a great question, and I think, I have family in Italy, and I spent a lot of time there recently. And you're right; they look very healthy, but it's interesting that fertility rates are going down so high. And I would point to cultures where, such as the Maasai in Africa. Now, this is a culture that has only had meat and they'll drink blood and raw milk and sometimes a little bit of honey, but no carbs of any kind of plants. And they're one of the most physically robust, lacking all of the diseases of Western society. I mean, no cases of cancer, no cases of heart disease. And the same as the Inuit. So I guess I don't think that my wife and I have discussions about this all the time. You know, we're raising 4 daughters, and it's impossible to escape some of the Western diet. And I know Saifedean does. Like, he's strict carnivore, and it works for him, and he's an inspiration in that. I'm not. So I do, like, I drink a lot of raw milk, but it's my birthday dinner a few nights ago, and my wife made like a pumpkin pie with maple syrup, and I had some of that. So I think that you can still be healthy, and I know there's debate over this, while eating a moderate amount of plants and sugar. For myself, it's a matter of self-control. When I have a little bit of sugar, I usually need a lot more. And I also think that our palates have shifted over time. I mean, the fruits that we're eating today are not the fruits people were eating 150 years ago. An apple today is a sugar bomb, and it's been hybridized to be very different than it used to be. So it's really, really tricky. But also, you go to Europe, and a lot of the foods that we eat today in chemicals, Kennedy talks a lot about this more eloquently than I can, but they're banned. They don't have a lot of the additives that we do. A lot of the fertilizers and sprays and just garbage that is industrial waste, all the garbage is put on our food. A lot of it is, they don't have that. So I think that,
Right.
also a lot of their genetics are better than ours. We've been eating like this now for 60 years. Europe is behind us in eating like garbage.
Well, and it actually does affect your DNA. It causes like the destruction of your cells and your ability to function properly. But you're absolutely right. It was always crazy to me when I saw the comparison lists of ingredients for the exact same product. Some of
Yeah.
them are massive, big brand names. This is how it's made in Italy or the UK. This is how it's made in America. And it's all these chemicals and dyes that are banned there. And normally I'm not in favor of a lot of regulation and government intervention, but I do think that this is an area where we're behind. I mean, maybe someone should step in and say, you can't use these unhealthy ingredients because you are getting even children hooked on extremely unhealthy things that will later have to pay for in terms of their health care and the need for them to be on drugs, or God forbid they get, fatal diseases. Do you agree with that?
I have very strict libertarian leanings, so this is difficult for me. I don't like government bans, but I guess in this instance, there's fraud being committed. And
Hmm.
I outline this in my book extensively. It's fraud. We're poisoning people, and we're doing it. You go into the cereal aisle, Natalie, in a modern day American grocery store, and you look, these people who are overweight, they're looking at the box of Cocoa Puffs, and it says heart healthy. It's a
Hmm.
seal by the government
I
saying
know.
this is good for you. That's fraud, and these people should be held accountable. And Dr. Fatima Stanford, who gets all these grants from the government, goes on 60 Minutes and says, we don't have control of our own health or our weight. And then she's being paid by these drug companies. She's part of an army of disinformation. And I think that they should be held to the standard of fraud. So while I'm against virtually any government regulations of anything, they're lying about the information and the fraud. And I think that I hope for the day that there's civil cases brought against these
Yeah.
food manufacturers for defrauding the American public and the consequences on the health of the people.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. That is a great way of putting it. It actually made me giggle when I read one of Saifedean's chapters where he talks about his carnivore hack when he travels. Because I was at a dinner with him at the Miami conference about 2 years ago, and he shared what he wrote about in your book. So when it came up, I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so funny that it's going public." The fact that he eats McDonald's patties. I mean,
Yeah.
he doesn't have trouble adhering to carnivore because when he travels, he'll go to a fast food joint that you would think is extremely unhealthy. And he says that the patties are 100% beef and they're cooked in their own fat and there are no additives, no chemicals. And so he just orders a bunch of burger patties, which is so funny. But so, I mean, there are essentially hacks, right? And Safe offered some of his sort of recommendations on how to adhere to a healthier diet. For me, I buy imported flour. I do not eat American flour that has potentially all these chemicals in it. I want Italian flour. I bring it back from my travels. I want Polish flour that doesn't have it. But you have to really take accountability and personal responsibility, because if you walk into a grocery store, I mean, most of it's inedible, right?
Yeah, one of the interesting things that came up in my book was that just 80 years ago, people really wanted to eat real food. It didn't even occur to people to not eat real food. I mean, everybody ate food. And then when Procter and Gamble, after the Industrial Revolution, people stopped buying candles. They had all this cottonseed waste. They didn't know what to do with the cottonseed waste. So what really began was this huge campaign to convince people to eat something that wasn't food, which was Crisco, cottonseed. And this was really a monumental step in the degradation of American health, because at first people intuitively understood, that this is shady. Like, what is this? And in the case of margarine, which was a similar case, it was called oil margarine at the time, there were riots over people substituting margarine for butter and not telling the public. I mean, there were court hearings over this. It was a really intense issue. And over time, especially when World War II hit and you see people needed to start cutting back costs, and you see industry began capturing something in particular called the Nutrition Foundation, was heavily influenced by, it was all sponsored by industry. They began promoting non-foods as foods. And we're living largely in part in the afterglow, in the manifestation of this coming to fruition. Now we accept, you told a story about your mom, and it's interesting because my dad, I remember once my mom put margarine on a piece of toast, and he ate it, and my dad didn't care about food. He wasn't thinking about it. He just didn't recognize it as food. He was like, Gina, what is this? I can't eat. What did you put it? And it wasn't food to him. It didn't seem like food. But he was right.
Yeah.
And
No,
my mom
and I
was
think
like, but Arthur, it's healthy. You should eat it. It's healthy, because that's how it was promoted. It was promoted as a healthy alternative to butter. We now know that it had horrible health effects, which is what we're going to find out about many of the foods we're eating today in short time.
I know. Again, it's crazy. You have to empower yourself with this knowledge and make those decisions, especially for your family members and children, because they're probably hearing the exact opposite messaging from their teachers and from their schools. One company I really like, have you heard of Seed Oil Scout? They find restaurants that cook without seed oils, and they kind of put them on a map so that people can find places that still cook with things like olive oil or tallow or beef lard. One question I wanted to ask you before we start to wrap up is, Loma Linda University, it was a red flag for me when you wrote about it, because I watched a movie and I read books about blue zones.
Yeah.
And we touched on it a little bit, right? The idea of Italy, Sardinia is one of them, Okinawa, Japan is one of them, where people live to be very, very old. And some scientists have gone out and explored, like, what are they eating? What are they doing to live so long? And of course, there are some social aspects to it, because they live much more social, stress-free lives than us. But Loma Linda University was one of the blue zones here in America. And one thing that stuck out to me was their diet. It was mostly grains and lentils. And they showed folks that were there. And I reported right outside that community. So that's why I'm so familiar with it. But they were living to be over 100. Is this an anomaly, or is this fake studies? What is it?
No, I think so. One of the things you notice about, and I can't speak to all of them, but all of the studies done, every one of them was an observational study. So like, I can come up with a study. I can poll people who've had cancer, and I can find out that 97% of them at some point have had raw milk or milk. And then I can come up with a headline that is accurate, saying milk linked to cancer. What you find about the Seventh-day Adventist Church is that they don't smoke. They have really good social groups. They don't eat a lot of processed food. So there's these variables that it's really difficult to dive into. You can manipulate this data any way you really want to. So I'm not besmirching like a lot of these lifestyles. If I find a lot of people, I went on a vegetarian diet. I was on a vegetarian diet years ago, and I remember feeling instantly better for the first 6 weeks because I stopped eating the garbage I had grown up eating, and I'm eating plants. But then my energy fell off a cliff after 6 weeks. It's
Mhm.
like I couldn't play basketball or run and do the things I wanted to do. Um, but Loba Linda is people don't understand the influence that the Seventh Day Adventist Church has on the modern American food system. And unlike corporate influence or the fiat money printer, their convictions are very like honestly held. They believe that eating meat makes our bodies impure for the afterlife, and they're trying to save society. And one of the more interesting parts of my book that I researched was how the Seventh Day Adventist Church started with a woman named Ellen G. White, who got hit in the head with a rock and then felt like she was getting visions from God, and God was saying, stop letting people eat meat because it causes carnal desires, which lead to all diseases. And I know this is going to sound insane to your audience, but at the time, early 1900s, late 1800s, most people believe, a lot of physicians believe that carnal desires were the cause of almost all disease. And restraining those was health. So she actually hired a guy named John Harvey Kellogg to come up with a drug, a food to stop people, especially young men, from eating meat for breakfast and to lower testosterone levels. And he came up with Kellogg's cornflakes. His protege was somebody named Leanna Cooper, who started the American Dietetic Association, which became the entrenched government system of dietary policy, essentially. Still, despite the influence of the church, and despite corporate greed and trying to shift the food supply, in 1970, as we mentioned, people still ate meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The big shift came with fiat, when the government money printer began weaponizing the food system to lower costs, to make it appear as though food's affordable. Look at our leaders. They're doing great. We can all survive on boxes of cereal. And you had the CEO of Kellogg's just a few months ago come out and say, I think people really should start eating cereal, not just for breakfast, but for lunch and dinner too. It's super cost effective.
Oh yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
It's
Oh my
it's
gosh.
insane, but it's not by accident. And
Yeah.
it's all intentional. It's part of a 60-year gaslighting campaign. I appreciate you having me on to tell this extremely bizarre. I know it sounds bizarre, but if you buy the book, I mean, I have over 200 citations. I'm not
Yeah.
like this is not a conspiracy. This is all out there for anybody to see.
Yeah, I mean, the research was fantastic. You also talked about graham crackers, how they were meant to
Ugh.
suppress your sex drive, and grape nuts and granola and these things that really are pushed as health foods. And then you zoom out, and today one of the biggest problems, especially with men, is lower testosterone, lower drive to have children, and all of that impacts what makes us fertile and productive and able to actually create the generations that are going to sustain the world in the future. So as we start to wrap up, what's maybe a takeaway message? Because I think that some of this can be very overwhelming. People are probably going to their pantries and thinking there's nothing edible in there, or everything's harmful or could cause cancer. So what do you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, I hope you buy my book, Fiat Food, but you don't have to. Go check out what your great great grandmother bought and ate and how she cooked. It was pretty much spot on. Uh, you know, uh, we're the only species that's confused about what to eat, and it's no accident. The government has tilted the tables against us. But just, I want your audience to know that you have a very, I've watched your show for a while, Natalie, and it's like you have a very independent minded followership, and like there it's not a conventional audience that you have. And just to remember that independence, that health presupposes independence, and that if we're not physically healthy, we're not able to really exert the self-autonomy that is our God-given right. So to take control of their diet, to ignore a lot of this noise, ignore a lot of the modern medical nutrition advice, and just come back down to the basics and try to do it one step at a time. It's not going to happen overnight. And don't beat yourself up when you do stop at the donut shop. But the more you introduce meat, the more you're satiated. And then you're not craving anything else. Nina Teicholz, who's done great work on this, she's the author of The Big Fat Surprise. Her advice to me when I was trying to get off the modern American food diet was start your morning with red meat. It's like a big help because then most of the overweight people today are actually nutrient deprived. So they're always craving food. Where if you start off with some red meat, then you're setting your day up to have some defense against those cravings that are inevitable.
Right.
And once you can make it just a week or two, then the cravings start going away.
No, it's so true. It's really, really good advice. I hope everyone checks out your book. And you're absolutely right. I mean, people shouldn't beat themselves up. It's the food that has gotten you so addicted, and your body doesn't know how to process some of these chemicals, and it does lock it away in fat cells, and then it doesn't know how to use it for energy. And that's why it's so hard sometimes to burn it off. And maybe we can get into the science of that a little bit later in another discussion, but just great book. I think you're doing such a service for so many people. And as cliche as it sounds, Bitcoin fixes this by addressing the heart of the matter, which is the financial system. So I hope everyone gets your book, and Matt, we'll have to have you back on. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
Thank you so much for checking out this episode of Coin Stories. This show is for entertainment and educational purposes only. Nothing should constitute as official investment advice, and you should always do your own research. My inbox is open. If you want to share feedback or guest suggestions, just reach out at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Make sure you're subscribed to the show and check out my free newsletter, nataliebrunel.substack.com. I'll see you next time.